In January 2025, a secret letter leaked from Washington, D.C. shook the African continent. It was not a request, not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. The letter, reportedly sent from the highest offices of power in the United States, carried a chilling message to one of Africa's poorest yet richest nations: surrender 70% of your gold reserves, or face the consequences. The target was Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation with one of the world's richest deposits of gold, a nation struggling with poverty yet sitting on billions of dollars worth of untapped treasure. But this was not the first time Africa had been asked to hand over its wealth. This was just the latest chapter in a story centuries old. What followed was a story of resistance, courage, betrayal, and hope. A story that would change the course of Africa's future. This is the story of the Gold War 2025, the day Africa defied the West and said no. To understand why Burkina Faso refused the ultimatum, we must travel back in time. Africa's struggle against Western exploitation did not begin in 2025, it began centuries ago with slavery, colonization, and economic domination. When colonial powers first arrived, they took men and women as slaves. When slavery ended, they took land. When land reforms failed, they took resources. And in the modern world, they took money, through loans, debts, and interest rates designed to keep nations trapped forever. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rich in gold, uranium, and oil, remained among the poorest on earth. Why? Because the system was designed that way. Even when leaders tried to rise, they were eliminated. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and of course, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi's dream was a United States of Africa, backed by a gold-based currency that would free Africa from the Western financial system. But in 2011, NATO bombs silenced that dream. Gaddafi was gone, and Africa learned a painful lesson: whoever challenges the system is destroyed. But in 2025, a new generation of leaders was ready. And this time, they would not be silenced. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the air was tense. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old revolutionary leader, sat with his top advisors. On the table lay the ultimatum from the West. They had 48 hours to respond. Some ministers argued surrender was the only way. If we refuse, sanctions will crush us. Our people are already hungry. Do we want war with the most powerful nations on earth? Others argued resistance. If we give them our gold today, tomorrow they will take our land. If we bow now, our children will never stand again. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Traore. He rose and spoke with calm but firm words. Our ancestors died with dignity rather than live in chains. We will not sell our future for fear of today. If they want war, let them come. But we will not kneel. And with that decision, history was made. As the ultimatum expired, something unexpected began to happen. Across the Sahel region, whispers of solidarity turned into a roar. Niger, Mali, and Guinea, three nations facing the same pressure, reached out to Traore. They understood the stakes. If Burkina Faso fell, they would be next. Within weeks, the alliance of Sahel states was born. It was not just a military pact, it was a declaration of independence from centuries of exploitation. Leaders met in secret bunkers, drafting plans to protect their gold, secure their borders, and resist foreign pressure. Their combined strength was modest compared to NATO, but their determination was unshakable. For the first time in decades, African nations were uniting not under the influence of foreign powers, but against them, and Paris, Washington, and London, panic spread. The intelligence reports were clear. If these nations succeeded in forming an independent financial bloc, it would inspire others across the continent. In Beijing and Moscow, however, opportunity emerged. China offered infrastructure projects in exchange for partnership. Russia promised weapons and military training. The West branded Traore and his allies as dictators, terrorists, and destabilizers. But across African youth networks on TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook, a different narrative was going viral. Memes celebrated Traore as the African Che Guevara. Videos compared him to Sankara, Lumumba, and Gaddafi. Hashtags like #AfricaRises and #GoldWar trended worldwide. This was not just a geopolitical conflict anymore, it had become a battle for the soul of Africa. Western sanctions soon followed. Aid was cut off. Banking channels were frozen. International media painted apocalyptic pictures of hunger and chaos. Yet, on the ground, something remarkable happened. Instead of collapsing, people in Burkina Faso began to rally. Farmers shared food across villages. Youth militias volunteered to protect borders. Local gold miners refused to sell to foreign companies and instead stockpiled reserves for the nation. What was supposed to be a punishment turned into a movement of self-reliance. But the fight was not only in the streets and fields. It was also in the information war. CNN broadcasted images of starving children, accusing Traore of tyranny. Meanwhile, African influencers uploaded videos showing communities organizing, schools reopening, and people chanting slogans of unity. One side portrayed despair, the other portrayed defiance. And for the first time, millions of Africans believed their story mattered more than the one told abroad. Yet, the question of gold remained at the heart of the war. Why gold? Because gold is power. Gold is currency. Gold is independence. For decades, African gold reserves were shipped quietly to European banks, backing the wealth of others while Africa remained poor. The ultimatum of 2025 was not just about bullion. It was about keeping Africa locked in a system where resources flow out and poverty remains in. By refusing to hand over their reserves, Burkina Faso and its allies were challenging centuries of economic domination. But defiance came with danger. Satellite images showed unusual military activity near Sahel borders. Analysts warned of possible interventions disguised as peacekeeping missions. The United Nations held emergency meetings, but behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. This was not about peace. This was about power. The story of the Gold War 2025 is still unfolding. But one thing is certain, Africa has crossed a point of no return. The day Burkina Faso said no, the continent realized it could resist. The day Niger, Mali, and Guinea joined, the continent realized it could unite. And the day millions of young Africans raised their voices online, the continent realized it could shape its own narrative. Oh, what happens next? Two futures stand before us. In one, Africa succeeds in building a gold-backed alliance, breaking free from Western financial chains, and inspiring dozens of nations to follow. In the other, the alliance is crushed through sanctions, covert operations, and internal betrayals, reminding Africa once again of the cost of resistance. Which future will come true depends not only on leaders like Traore, but on the millions of ordinary Africans who must decide whether to stand or to kneel. For the first time in decades, Africa has looked the West in the eye and refused to bow. History will remember this moment as the day a continent whispered a single word and shook the earth. The day Africa said no. And now, the question is yours. Was this bravery, or a dangerous gamble? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you want more hidden stories the media won't show you, make sure to subscribe, because this is only the beginning of the Gold War 2025. As the 30-day deadline approached, tension gripped the capital. Rumors swirled that France would never accept the order. Some whispered that French intelligence was plotting to overthrow Traore. Others feared the arrival of shadowy mercenaries sent to assassinate him before the withdrawal could be completed. Yet the young captain walked calmly through the streets, unafraid, saluting children, shaking hands with old women, and telling them, "Burkina Faso belongs to you, not to foreigners." At night, his advisors begged him to reconsider, to negotiate, to allow at least a symbolic French presence to remain. But Traore's answer was firm: "If we compromise today, we will be slaves tomorrow." Meanwhile, across the Sahel, something remarkable began to happen. Ordinary people in Mali, Niger, and Guinea flooded the streets, carrying posters of Traore and chanting his name. To them, he was no longer just the leader of Burkina Faso. He was the face of a new African defiance. Youth movements painted murals of him alongside Sankara and Lumumba. Farmers in distant villages named their newborns after him. In a single act of courage, he had ignited a flame across the continent. But France was not ready to lose quietly. French media outlets launched a wave of propaganda, portraying Traore as a dangerous dictator leading his country into chaos. Editorials in Paris warned that Burkina Faso would fall apart without Western support. Diplomats began pressuring neighboring countries to isolate the young leader. Even the United Nations issued cautious statements urging dialogue and cooperation. Traore, however, had anticipated this storm. He turned to new allies. Russian planes began landing in Ouagadougou with crates of weapons and supplies. Turkish drones were suddenly seen flying over Burkinabe skies. Young volunteers poured into the military, eager to fight under their own flag rather than serve under foreign orders. Traore called it the birth of a people's army. His message was simple: Burkina Faso will fight for itself, with or without the West. The deadline day finally arrived. The sun rose over Ouagadougou as thousands of citizens filled the streets, waving flags, singing revolutionary songs, and waiting for history. Convoys of French armored vehicles rolled out of their bases, heading toward the border. Some soldiers looked out at the crowds in disbelief. Never before had they been forced to leave like this, not in Algeria, not in Mali, not in Niger. As the last helicopter lifted off, cheers erupted across the city. Women ululated, men fired rifles into the air, and children climbed rooftops shouting, "Victory! Sovereignty! Freedom!" In that moment, Traore had done what few believed possible. He had ended a century-long cycle of dependency in one bold stroke. But victory came with consequences. Within weeks, insurgent attacks intensified. Armed groups tried to test the Burkinabe army, believing it too weak without French support. Dozens of villages came under fire. Traore responded with ferocity. He launched sweeping military campaigns, sending soldiers deep into the countryside, not just to fight, but to live with the people, to eat their food, to protect their families. For the first time, villagers saw soldiers not as distant officials but as brothers. This built trust. This built unity. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Communities that once feared the rebels now formed local defense groups, trained by the army, supplied by the government. The fight was far from over, but the spirit of resistance was alive. Meanwhile, in Paris, anger turned to desperation. Economic retaliation followed. French companies began pulling out. Aid was suspended. Financial pressure mounted. But Traore remained defiant. "We have survived droughts, famine, and war," he declared in a fiery speech. "We will also survive without French aid." To back his words, he turned to gold. Revenues from the country's mines, once quietly siphoned abroad, were redirected into state coffers. For the first time, Burkina Faso's gold was funding schools, hospitals, and soldiers, not lining the pockets of foreign shareholders. This economic independence shocked observers in the West. They had never imagined a small war-torn nation could dare to challenge the financial order. And then came the boldest move of all. In a dramatic televised address, Traore stood before the nation, holding a thick pile of documents. They were debt agreements, loans signed with foreign banks over decades. With a single gesture, he tossed them into a fire. Flames consumed the paper as the crowd roared. "Burkina Faso owes nothing to the colonizers," he thundered. "Our only debt is to our children." The image raced across social media, electrifying Africa. In Dakar, in Bamako, in Kinshasa, young people shared the video with tears in their eyes. For them, this was not just about Burkina Faso. This was about an entire continent rising from its knees. But with every act of defiance, the danger grew. Assassination plots were uncovered. Foreign spies were caught within the capital. Even within his own ranks, whispers of betrayal circulated. Yet Traore pressed on. He declared that no leader should fear death if the people were behind him. He often reminded his soldiers of Sankara's words, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." And indeed, the idea was alive. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders followed his example, expelling French troops and challenging Western dominance. A new regional alliance was born, one that rejected dependency and embraced sovereignty. Months passed. It became clear, Ibrahim Traoré had changed the course of African history. His decision to expel 5,000 French troops overnight was more than a political act. It was a declaration of independence in the 21st century. It was a spark that lit the fire of unity. And though the battles ahead were many, the message was already written in the hearts of millions. Africa will no longer be ruled from abroad. Africa will no longer bow to foreign armies. Africa will rise, and Burkina Faso will forever be remembered as the place where the new chapter began. The world had been watching silently, but silence was no longer possible. Western capitals held emergency meetings, their analysts struggling to understand how a 35-year-old captain had forced one of the strongest armies in the world to retreat without a fight. In Washington, intelligence reports warned that Traoré's defiance could inspire a wave of anti-Western sentiment across Africa. In Brussels, officials worried about the future of European mining contracts in the Sahel. In Paris, anger burned hottest. Generals whispered that France had lost not just a military base, but a century of influence. Economists warned that gold shipments were being disrupted, cutting into profits that had long flowed steadily into European banks. And in the media, a new narrative began. Ibrahim Traoré was painted as reckless, radical, and dangerous. Yet for millions of Africans, the more the West tried to discredit him, the more his image grew. He was no longer just a leader of Burkina Faso. He was a symbol of freedom. But symbols carry weight, and with weight comes risk. Not long after the French troops departed, strange events began to unfold. Power outages struck the capital without explanation. Food supply chains were mysteriously disrupted. Arms smugglers began flooding the borders with weapons, fueling insurgencies at a scale never seen before. It was clear to Traoré and his advisors, they were not simply fighting rebels. They were fighting a shadow war, a war designed to punish them for daring to be free. Traoré responded not with despair, but with resolve. He summoned his cabinet and declared, "If they will starve us, we will grow our own food. If they will cut our power, we will build our own dams. If they will deny us weapons, we will forge our own alliances. This is the price of independence, and we will pay it." His words spread like fire, repeated in classrooms, in mosques, in marketplaces. The nation was suffering, but it was suffering with pride. Meanwhile, across Africa, a shift was unfolding. In Niger, crowds surrounded French bases demanding withdrawal. In Mali, soldiers painted the Burkinabe flag on their tanks as a sign of solidarity. Guinea announced a joint defense pact with Burkina Faso, declaring that an attack on one will be an attack on all. This alliance terrified Western observers, who had relied for decades on a divided Africa. Suddenly, the borders that had been drawn by colonizers meant less than the unity that was being forged in the streets. The phrase, "United Sahel," began trending on African social media, alongside images of Traoré in his military uniform, his fist raised defiantly against the sky. And yet, the threats were real. One night, as Traoré returned to his residence, an explosion rocked the capital. A car bomb, detonated near the presidential compound, left the city in chaos. Dozens were killed, and once again rumors swirled of foreign involvement. Traoré appeared on television the next morning, his voice steady though his eyes revealed exhaustion. "They can bomb our cities. They can send their spies. They can try to kill me. But they cannot kill what we have started. Burkina Faso will never bow again." His calm defiance only deepened the people's love for him. Mothers wept as they watched his speech. Farmers in remote villages vowed to give their last grain to the army. Soldiers swore they would die before allowing him to be taken. Internationally, reactions were polarizing. In Africa, Traoré was celebrated as a hero. Student movements in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya organized rallies in his support. Music videos praised him as the Lion of the Sahel. But in Western media, he was branded as a populist demagogue who was dragging his country into ruin. The contrast was striking. To some, he was a liberator, to others, a dangerous revolutionary. Yet Traoré himself cared little for what was written abroad. His focus remained firmly on his people. He visited schools under construction, walked through muddy refugee camps, and personally distributed food to villagers. Everywhere he went, crowds surrounded him, chanting, "Traoré! Traoré! Traoré!" For a people long ignored, long dismissed as powerless, he was living proof that even the smallest nation could stand up to giants. But the challenges ahead were immense. Without French financial support, the economy struggled. Inflation soared. Imports became more expensive. Ordinary families bore the burden of independence. Critics inside the country began to whisper that perhaps the old ways, however unjust, had at least kept food on the table. Traoré faced the most dangerous enemy of all, doubt. To counter it, he launched what he called the Burkina Renaissance. State-owned factories were reopened to process local cotton and grain. A campaign for food self-sufficiency encouraged urban youth to return to farming, with the government providing seeds and tools. Energy projects were launched, including solar farms and small hydroelectric dams. Progress was slow, But it was visible. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe gold was melted and minted into national coins instead of being shipped abroad. For the first time, a farmer could sell his harvest directly to a local mill, rather than to foreign traders. These small victories kept hope alive, and Paris, the humiliation festered. Former officials gave interviews lamenting the loss of Burkina Faso, as though it were property that had been stolen. Secret discussions were held about how to destabilize Traoré's government. But the world was changing. China and Russia saw opportunity where the West saw rebellion. Delegations arrived in Ouagadougou offering trade deals, infrastructure projects, and military cooperation. For the first time, Burkina Faso had options. It no longer had to accept terms dictated by one power. This multipolar shift was reshaping Africa itself, and Traoré stood at the center of it. Months turned into a year, and the story of the expulsion of 5,000 French troops became legend. Children learned about it in school as though it were already history. Poets wrote about it as a modern epic. Musicians sang of it as a song of liberation. Across the Sahel, it was told again and again. The night the colonizers left, the night freedom returned. Yet for Traoré, the work was far from done. He often reminded his people that victory against foreign troops was only the first step. The real battle was against poverty, ignorance, and corruption. In fiery speeches, he declared that Burkina Faso would not simply change masters, but would build a new future entirely of its own making. He urged his people not to worship him but to take responsibility for their nation. "Do not follow me," he said. "Follow the dream of a free Africa." But history is not kind to revolutionaries. As Traoré's fame spread, so too did the threats. More assassination attempts were uncovered. More propaganda was unleashed. Some of his closest allies were tempted by bribes and promises from abroad. Traoré knew that at any moment he could be betrayed, even by those sitting at his side. And yet he accepted this fate. "If I must die," he told a gathering of students, "let me die knowing that you will continue. Leaders can fall, but the people must rise. That is true independence." The students erupted in applause, many with tears in their eyes. They understood the weight of his words. They understood that the revolution was bigger than one man. And so, the legacy of that single decision, to expel 5,000 French troops overnight, grew larger than life. It became not just a moment in Burkina Faso's story, but a turning point in Africa's story. Generations to come would look back and see it as the day the tide began to turn. A day when one small nation dared to tell the world, "No more." A day when fear was replaced by courage. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, though the enemies were many, though the struggle was far from over, the flame had been lit. That flame burned in the eyes of a young boy in Ouagadougou who dreamed of becoming a soldier like Traoré. It burned in the heart of a mother in Bamako who taught her daughter that Africa could stand tall. It burned in the voices of millions who sang his name not just as a leader, but as a symbol of what was possible. The West had lost more than troops. It had lost control of a narrative it had owned for centuries. And in its place, a new story was being written, a story of sovereignty, of dignity, of resistance. For the rest of the world, the question lingered, what would happen next? Would Traoré survive the endless storms that followed? Would Burkina Faso succeed in building the future he envisioned? No one could say for certain. But one truth was undeniable. The expulsion of 5,000 French troops had shattered the illusion that Africa would forever remain chained. It had proved that courage, even from a small nation, could shake the foundations of empires. And whether Ibrahim Traoré lived to see the end of the struggle or not, his act would echo through history like a drumbeat, the sound of a continent awakening.